I have a random piece of paper that I found in a drawer to start out. It's maybe mixed media paper, and I'm adding a wash of water on the top. For this painting, you can use really any family of colors that you would like to. Do pinks and reds like I do here, or you could do golds and yellows or blues and greens, things like that. Just kind of mess around with your colors. But again, here I've got a mixture of all of my reds in my palette and a little bit of gold here and there. I'm just kind of randomly planning out the colors, getting them and pushing them into each other and letting it generally just spread around and let them absorb into the paper. They're not absorbing very well, which makes this not very good paper. If you're using good 140 pound, maybe Arches cold press paper, you'd have a lot easier time making this painting. But I was working with what I had and it still works out just fine in the end. I'm trying to be as random as possible while still using all of the colors, and then let them swim around and create a pattern. Next, you will dry the paper completely. I've used graphite paper and a cut-out photograph. You could use any photograph, whether it be a clipping from a magazine or a printed image that you have. You can trace any flower, any shapes that you want to on top of this. Since it's such a random pattern, you can do whatever you'd like to on top as far as tracing. Then I'm just going in with the same sort of background colors that I used before and outlining and kind of doing a repeat of the wash, but I don't need to do it as thick. I'll let the background colors bleed through, but generally outlining the shapes that I traced on. I'm still being very loose with my colors, but trying to go a little more saturated. If you really saturate the background on your painting, it'll just make your shapes pop even more by having the contrast. Again, this technique, generally getting a very basic background in whatever colors you want, and then tracing your reference on top of it with graphite paper. You can use literally any photograph that you can imagine on top of this in using this general process. It's very easy, very fun to mess around with, and very freeing. That, and we don't have to be very careful to stay within the lines. So I'm going in and I'm darkening the base of some of the petals, not all of them, and even then I'm not being very precise, because once we go around and trace the petals later on, which you'll see, it's going to not need to even stay within the shapes, and you'll see what I mean once we get there. So you can really mess around with anything and try out a dozen different ways of doing this with a dozen different references, and you'll get something new and interesting each time. It's a great way to learn watercolors without having to think so hard about what you're painting. It's kind of like creating a coloring book for yourself. I'm still just kind of staying within the same family of colors. I'll introduce green with the leaves later, but I'm still just kind of working with those same colors that I had begun with. And I'm being quite random with which ones I pick up. You don't even have to plan this very much. I'm somewhat staying within the lines, and you can even be more particular than I am and stay really within the lines and really fill in your shapes. And you can use your photo as reference if you're trying to be even more specific. With the leaves here, I have decided to just kind of wet it down and drop color in there. If you're using better paper, you will have more saturated colors and an easier time spreading it around, but you don't need to use a great paper. If you're just there to kind of have fun with it, you can use whatever thick sort of mixed media paper that you have available. Then I'm just kind of going around and splattering colors. I might have been taking some anger out on the paper, if I'm being completely honest, but I like the contrast that it brings into the background, and I like taking some of that green into the rest of the paper and around the design. I think it gives it a nice feeling, plus having just a little bit more detail, especially when we go back into trace these objects. It's just nice to have that mixed in, gives it a really cool effect. So I'm doing dark green and some more of my red, and I'm really just upping the contrast in a few places. Again, you can see I'm just not being careful. I'm not even being too worried about the colors bleeding into each other. The step after this one will make all of it work. So I have a white gel pen, and I'm going around my tracing following the lines that I had before. That being said, when I was painting, I wasn't being too particular, so sometimes those lines might not fit exactly where the light and the dark paint is, but that's what gives it this really cool effect. So follow your lines, and sometimes you have to invent them, and sometimes you have to use your reference photo again, which you'll see me do later on. So have that still handy, and that might give you a good idea if you're not quite sure where a shape went. And trace those lines whether or not the paint underneath is actually showing that shape. And again, it gives this really cool painterly look to have the shapes happen on top of the background where it's painted differently. Keep that reference handy, and you might just need to figure out what you're looking at later on. Once you're done with the shapes, you might then just decide to add in some extra little touches. I decided the rest of the painting was a little empty, so I'm going to use the same technique I used to paint from the reference or draw from the reference, and I'm going to go ahead and bring in more leaves, and you can see it still looks nice even not having any of the green in the background. It's just a cool little detail that you can include with just that gel pen. You could do a pattern instead, you could do stripes, you could do polka dots, which you see me do here. You can really mess around with it, and now that you've got the shapes in and you've traced everything else, now it's time to explore what you think will make it look better. And of course, whenever possible, make it fancy. My favorite thing is to bring in some gold whenever possible. I believe this metallic gold marker is legitimately from the dollar store, and I think it did a pretty good job. The paper also bled along the edges just a little bit more, just because again it's not really watercolor paper. I think it's mixed media. So just be careful when you're choosing paper. Make sure that tape is all the way down, especially on those other papers. Thank you so much for painting with me. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you're inspired to paint on your own.